Morning, everybody. So I'm Roby Ganguly, CEO and co-founder of Apptentive, Google Ventures-backed company that is really focused on making it easy for every company with an app to talk with their customers. So I'll just kick it off. I'm always open to questions and interruptions. It's fine, just raise your hand or send it through the online forum. So, we're in this business for a really simple reason, and that's because consumers today are really obsessed with their smartphones. We check them first thing in the morning, last thing at night. We have anxiety around when our battery is low or it's dead. And as a result of that, more and more businesses every day are really coming around to the fact that their consumers are on their smartphones, and this is a great place to connect with their customers. And so many of you are probably already in the space making apps, and you've realized pretty quickly that this is a great place to engage and get adoption and deliver your services. But as a consumer, when you're using these apps and you have a problem or a question or something doesn't make sense, or maybe you just want to have a deeper connection with that company you're dealing with, where do you find yourself? Today, the answer is the App Store, right? This App Store is a wall between us and the people who make the apps. It's a place where we vent. We're frustrated. We rant, and it's not even clear that anybody's actually really listening, that they're on the other end and they're reading these comments. And from the publisher's perspective, from the companies who are making these apps, it's really even worse because you know that every new consumer who interacts with your app sees this first, right? And you don't really have any context or any real meaningful way to develop a relationship or respond to your consumers in the app stores. So what we hear over and over again from publishers is that the ratings and reviews in the App Store are really no better than graffiti on a wall. And this is where we come in. This is a really big communications failure, and so our company is obsessed with bringing that connection together between consumers and the publishers behind the apps. So a very quick overview of the things that we are really great at. We're very focused on being the best company, allowing you to engage with your customers, whether that's delivering in-app surveys, whether that's driving better ratings and reviews at scale and getting actionable customer feedback, or really improving your app retention. And the underlying point around all of this is that we believe that happy customers become loyal customers, and loyal customers generate revenue and really drop to the bottom line. And we think that you have to be obsessed with having very loyal customers who love you over the long term if you want to be successful. So that's sort of a quick overview. But I know that many of us here in the Google Ventures community watch these videos online, and an hour is quite a bit of a long time. So I want to make a couple quick offers to you, really just knowing that you might not make it through the entire 60 minutes, or you might watch it a few weeks from now. If you're in the mobile app space and you want to talk about your app, if you want to ping us, get some advice, we're always here to help. That's actually our favorite way of interacting with customers because we love relationships too. So I'm Roby at apptentive.com. Just email me, say, we're a GV company, we want to chat with you, 15, 30 minutes, whatever works for you and your schedule. We're here to help. And also, really quickly, as a headline, we are making an offer to all GV portfolio companies on our plans and sign-up page. You guys get 3 months free. All you have to do is enter this code under the promotional code section. It's GV port code. So again, I know that everybody's busy. You don't necessarily make it through the entire video the first time around. So those are a couple of headlines. What am I going to be covering today? So really 4 big things, and we've covered the first one. So rest assured, this should be pretty straightforward. The big problem facing every company in the mobile app space, which is really this connection with your customers, knowing who they are, developing a relationship with them, understanding how to talk to them. Some details with a specific example of how we help, and then really digging in deeper, and this is going to be the bulk of the presentation, and talking about the mobile app business, end to end, the key drivers of that business, how you make money, how you retain customers, what the sort of leverage points you have are, and some of the components of a good mobile toolkit. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about one of our key customers, Urban Spoon. So Urban Spoon, old man in the App Store at this point in time. They've been around since 2008. They have over 20 million customers across multiple platforms. They're a 50-person company that actually is a subsidiary of IAC. And there's a pretty good chance that many of you already have installed Urban Spoon on your phone, which means you already have Apptentive in your pocket. And before they were working with us, Matt, the director of UX, who's one of our key customers there, was on a regular basis greeted with this when he would wake up in the morning. We know that a lot of people spend their time looking at the ratings and reviews in the App Store in order to get sentiment, to understand what's going on for their customer base. And so he would wake up in the morning and be greeted with a message like this, and he was frustrated. The reason he was frustrated was because this right here, this typical review, is not very useful. There's no context around what's going on for this customer. So for example, in this situation, customer's saying, I can't book reservations. That's a feature of that. But Matt doesn't have any way of understanding where that customer is. For example, he's in a market that Urban Spoon doesn't support. Or what he's trying to book a reservation for. Like, is this even relevant to him? Is it about a restaurant? Or is it a hotel and something that they don't even offer? Which I think we all know, sometimes customers come to you with questions about what you do that are just really not relevant. So this was really frustrating. But after starting to work with us and with a 2-line code change, Urban Spoon was able to turn their app into a communications vehicle. So they could actually really easily reach out proactively, try to figure out how somebody felt, for example. And the people who were frustrated, like for example this frustrated consumer, were actually in the app able to send this message and give context and start the beginning of the dialogue with Urban Spoon. And so when you have this dialogue, it opens up a conversation that actually can be productive. So Matthew was able to take this and see in his inbox, which is powered by Apptentive, this comment, and he's able to actually ask a further question, find out what's going on, discover that this customer is in St. Louis, and then tell them, hey, we know that's an issue. We are not in St. Louis yet, we're working on it. And because this dialogue actually is kind of specific and it requires some follow-up, Matthew was really easily able to add him to a group and make sure that he categorized this person appropriately. Fast forward a few weeks, Matthew and the Urban Spoon team, they've actually been working on rolling themselves out into multiple different markets. They actually launched in St. Louis. And with a couple clicks, they're able to communicate very quickly and personally back to the customers who are on that St. Louis announcement list. And the next time a customer opens up the app, this badge shows that Message Center, powered by Apptentive, has a message waiting for the consumer. And there's a personal and direct message that really communicates to that customer that you were listened to, your issue was heard, and you were remembered, which is very, very powerful. And so as a result, that consumer goes from being really frustrated and in a place where they're swearing to a place where they're like, wow, thank you. I love you guys. The reason that this is really important is that this doesn't really happen many times for us as consumers in the real world, and particularly in the app space. But we carry these devices with us all the time. They're the most personal technology we've ever owned. And now you're able to, in a matter of moments, get back into that person's pocket and connect directly and follow up and have a relationship that's productive. Now, how do you think about the results around this? What are the things that you drive? For Urban Spoon, this has become something that they look to as a real reason for like massive success in the App Store from a ratings perspective. Historically, they had 3.5 stars across the lifetime. Since working with us and communicating with their customers in a more deep manner, they have over 5 stars. Or not over 5 stars, they have 5 stars, right? They're pegged at the limit, which is fantastic. More importantly, they generate a huge amount more volume because they're interacting with these people on a regular basis. They're being proactive, they're reaching out, they're making happier customers and evangelists on a regular basis, over 11 times the daily reviews and ratings in the App Store. And where we really focus is this deeper notion of customer engagement and getting really loyal people. So we've done semantic analysis around how the language in the app stores has changed. And as a result of working with us, we've seen a 50% increase in the use of the word love in the App Store, which, when you think about it, is kind of extraordinary to open up an App Store page and then look at the ratings and reviews and see customers over and over again saying, I love this app. These guys are phenomenal. They provide great service. They always are helpful. That brings customers back over and over again, and it brings new customers in at a faster rate. So that's a pretty specific example of how customers are using us and some of the results that they're seeing. Now I want to step back a little bit and talk more broadly about the ecosystem and why this all really matters and is important to you. If you haven't been paying attention, the app stores have been growing tremendously. We're now at a point between the two major app stores, iTunes App Store and Google Play, where we have over 100 billion apps that have been downloaded. And to put that in perspective, the iTunes App Store just last week celebrated its 5th anniversary. Tremendous growth. In fact, the growth in the number of apps over the past 5 years has been astonishing. And we're at the place where we're about 2 million apps total in both markets combined. And Android has caught up pretty significantly to Apple. So we have basically parity. And then if you think about this in the context of the way we've seen growth in other markets before, like for example, the growth in websites, it really is a stark contrast, right? So think about this. It took approximately 6 years to go from 0 to 100,000 websites. It took about 5 years to go from 0 to 2 million different apps. So what we've seen, really, is unprecedented growth. And what we're talking about is unprecedented growth about consumer behavior, where people are. We think this is really amazing. If you haven't seen this before, the stats are that over the past 3 years, the time spent with mobile apps has reached a point where it is second only to television, right? So on average, the average American consumes between, approximately 2.5 to 3 hours of television a day. We're almost there already with mobile apps. And this growth is continuing unabated. So at some point in the next 2 years, we expect this to actually surpass time spent with television. What that means is it's a hugely important vehicle to connect with customers. And if you're making apps, you have to be thinking about your business in the context of how many apps you're competing against and how they're all trying to get the same thing that you are, which is time with your consumers. So our recommendation to you in thinking about this is that you really need to be very, very different. And it turns out that being different in the mobile app space today is as simple as listening to your customers, because honestly, most of the companies out there aren't. They're not investing in the tools or the resources or even the internal belief that their customers matter enough that they should be listening to them. Furthermore, when you have these customers who are using you on a regular basis, you can really reach out to them and learn from them. You can involve them in the process of making a better product. Feedback is incredibly important. I think that in the tech sector in particular, we would say over the past 5 years or so, customer development has taught us a lot about the importance of listening to your customers, soliciting feedback, and iterating as a result. This is a really big place where you, especially if you're sort of new to this and you're nimble and you have a really cohesive team that communicates well, can capitalize on feedback and release features and capabilities that really delight your customer base. So this is a real opportunity for everybody here to think about the ways in which they can capitalize on the things that traditional companies are not doing and not investing in. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the overarching environment of the mobile app space. And we call this equation essentially the math of the app business. It's really simple. There's only sort of 6 components here, but you need to get customers to install your app. A certain percentage of those customers will use you on a regular basis. Those are your retained users. If you think about that on a monthly basis, you have X number of monthly active users. So maybe you've had 500,000 downloads, and on a monthly basis, you're seeing 100,000 unique people. In that situation, your retention rate is 20%, which actually, it turns out, would be quite high. Each of those monthly active users represent an opportunity for you to make money in some way, whether you're monetizing through advertising, or you've got in-app purchases, or you're actually an e-commerce business, or you're the mobile front end for a SaaS-based enterprise business. This is where you make your money, is the people who are active, generally speaking. And so that then equates to revenue. Simple equation, but I'm going to refer to this quite a bit because this is where we dig in on how you can take your business, your mobile app business, and grow it. And I really think it's important to understand that these are the simple drivers for this. So let's start off on the first piece of this. I'm going to talk a little about installation. Importantly, if you look at how consumers find apps, the vast majority of that discovery of apps happens through what we call navigation. That's navigation inside the app stores, whether that's using search in the iTunes App Store or Google Play, or it's browsing the top list or going through categories. That's the main driver of consumer discovery today. Another 20+% are generated through external search. So actually searching on the web for some solution to a problem you have and then having an app come up as a recommendation, or referrals. And by referrals, I'm talking about your friends tell you something is cool in the App Store and you should go check it out, or a website that you're reading recommends the top 10 productivity apps, that sort of stuff. That's referral. All of those people ultimately have to come to your App Store page, right? That's your shelf space in the App Store. And so as a result, we find that many of the publishers that we work with haven't really thought hard enough about that moment of decision. That's where the conversion happens, because only a certain percentage of the people who see your App Store page are actually going to download your app. In fact, we see data that says approximately 1 in 3 customers or potential customers who visit an App Store page for an app that's free will download the app. The ratio is much lower, as you might imagine, for paid apps. So let's talk a little bit about the navigation. If you've got an Android device, you're familiar with the Google Play Store. Commonly, you'll open it up and you'll see these choices, and then you'll go into the menu for games, for example. If you like something there, you click through to the app details page. And what's important to note and think about as you're building your business and trying to get more installs and convert people at the App Store page, is that on average, a consumer will spend 30 to 60 seconds. It's not a lot of time looking at this page. So what do they look at? Well, they'll spend a little bit of time kind of looking at the description, the overview. And then we see that most consumers go to the reviews. There's actually a lot of interesting psychological research done over the past decade or so that says with digital goods in particular, because they're ephemeral, because we can't hold them in our hands, that decision-making is largely predicated on what other people tell us, that our best evaluation method are the ratings and reviews of those digital goods. And so with apps, this is very, very true. Of that 30 to 60 seconds, you can expect that 3/4 of the time spent is looking at what other people are saying about you. And this is why we've done this analysis around how many people are using the word love in your reviews, for example. Like, that language is very convincing. Even if the app is free, you're competing against no action, right? Somebody might look at your app page, say it's free, but it's got 3 stars, and I already have a lot of apps. There's no reason for me to actually waste time and install this. So you want to be thoughtful about the fact that this is driving a lot of the decision-making behavior. Also, when thinking about this, you want to think about how your app is showing up in search results. So when somebody says, I'm looking for hotels, what's an app that's going to help me with this? You want to be aware of the fact that if you show up in those search results, you are going to be ranked according to certain criteria in the App Store. And if you're thinking about it from a consumer's perspective, there are only a few pieces of information that are displayed on this page. The name of it, the brand might be something you recognize. Sometimes there's a recommendation. This is an editor's choice app. And then you've got ratings and reviews and the price, right? Very small pieces of information to make your selection on based upon when you show up in search. What makes this more frustrating is that the fact that the App Store designs are actually different, right? So we see this a lot. We see that customers started out on iOS and they kind of have a real understanding of how the App Store works in the iTunes App Store, and then they move to Google Play. So if you were to look, so we just went through Google Play, if you were to look at what iOS looks like, you'll notice that the design's different, right? The number of apps that are shown on these pages, there's a smaller number. The number of sort of banner spots, there are more of them in iOS. And in general, you can assume that iOS is more menu-driven and sort of hierarchical, and that Google is a little bit more search-driven. Makes sense, right? But then you also see that the app details pages have a much different look and feel. So for example, here we are looking at Glassboard, great app that we use when we go to conferences and interact with friends. And what do we see about this? Well, we see like sort of half the screenshot, we see the ratings and reviews, and the icon. So you want to be thinking about how you're showing up in these details pages in both app stores and thinking about what's going to be driving decision making and how you can optimize that. Search on the iPhone in particular it's a really interesting conundrum. So when you're on the iPhone, you're essentially shown one result at a time. And this is a reason why everybody in the app space should be thinking about App Store optimization, particularly around the search terms that they're showing up for, because on iOS, since you only are shown basically one result at a time, it's very, very important to be one of those top 3 results. People don't scroll past, from what we can tell, past the 5th or 6th result. On the iPad, it's a little bit different. You get a few more search results. So if you're making tablet apps primarily, you might see that search provides more installs for you even if you're outside of the top 5. So again, it's important, whatever platform you're on, that you go and test out your App Store details on those various devices, on tablets and on phones with different screen sizes, just to get a feel for it and make sure that you're thinking about your description and your screenshots as ultimately a piece of your marketing, and that you're thinking about the ratings and reviews. Because the conversion in the app stores is really dependent on 4 primary things: ratings and reviews. That's an area where you have potentially the most control and impact and influence over it, and consumer decision making is really heavily weighted towards ratings and reviews. Your description, something that you can change on a regular basis and experiment with. In fact, we find that the most effective descriptions are the descriptions that evolve out of customer conversations and feedback. Using your customer's language in your description turns out to be a very effective manner of communicating to them in the way that they're thinking about what you're doing. We often see app publishers in their first launch use their own language to describe the app. And by the 3rd launch, because they've interacted with enough of their customers, they've totally changed the verbs. They've changed the ways in which they're describing themselves. The call to action, the thing that they think is most important about the app, all of that's changed, and it's been revised to reflect what the consumers are saying back to them. So that description, really, you should view it as a place to iterate and experiment. Your icon is actually quite important, particularly we find with iOS consumers. There's a lot of emphasis on visual design and having a striking icon when you're surfing through the App Store. It turns out that also later on down the road, when you've gotten installed on a device, having a striking icon that people recognize as being yours is really important to people opening you back up. So you want to be thoughtful about that. And finally, your screenshots. And so screenshots certainly are valuable, but what we see as being the most effective use of screenshots is to not necessarily just snag pieces of your app and show that app or a screen in it, but actually to make them almost like marketing materials. And so what I mean by that is if you have a certain piece of functionality in your app that's really cool that everybody uses, it's a friend finder tool, or it's a chat app, and everybody really likes the emoticons you can send across to people because it makes you feel very deeply connected with the person on the other end of that conversation. It's not enough to just show that functionality in a screenshot. You want to actually take that screenshot and modify it so that you maybe use some text or highlight an aspect of that so that when somebody's looking at that screenshot, you're educating them about what's important on that. It's incredibly important in the mobile space in general to recognize that people have very little time, right? We're on our phones generally 3 and 5 minute windows, and the more that you can lead them to the conclusions, you want to. So that's sort of the App Store landscape. The primary vehicle for discovery of your apps really happens there, as I mentioned. I'm going to talk a little bit about the external landscape and the ways in which you can market yourself. We find a lot of publishers haven't really gotten to the point where they're thinking about this, and this is a place where, even though it's a small percentage today of consumer discovery, it's a very valuable component of consumer discovery, and it seems to be growing in importance over time. So for those of you who are in marketing or familiar with the notion of inbound marketing, something that's been really promoted and talked about quite a bit by the folks at Moz up in Seattle or HubSpot in Boston, as well as many other marketers. There's the idea that you really can create a lot of traffic from free sources, from putting out content, from doing SEO, from email marketing, from making sure that you're getting socially bookmarked, that people are linking to stories on your blog about what you've done. I think many of us are probably pretty familiar with apps that have written really interesting stories on Hacker News, right? Writing an interesting story on Hacker News that leads people back to your blog is an example of inbound marketing. It's something that you invest time in order to get attention, but you don't have to spend money on, right? These on the web turn out to be very valuable. With mobile, it's the same. We're earlier in the cycle, but it's similarly possible to get free traffic sources outside of the App Store using App Store inbound marketing. This is what we're calling it, just so everybody can understand the context of it. So one of the things that people do regularly is they'll go to app review sites and they'll ask for somebody to review their app. That turns out to be pretty powerful. It's not the only mechanism. We highly recommend thinking about what vertical you're in. So if your app is focused around cooking, for example, right? The cooking vertical has lots of different places where people are creating content on a regular basis. Lots of food bloggers out there, lots of recipe sites out there. You might be relevant to those. Have you talked to those people? Have you shared your content with them? Have you made their site more valuable by telling them about your app and what it does and ways in which consumers are using it? If you haven't, that's an opportunity for you. Also, thinking about the referral mechanisms, like friends talk about apps on a regular basis. Apps are discovered in the real world. So you want to make sure that if there are social pieces to your app, there are objects that people can share, that you're thinking about that in order to grow. And also journalists, not just the TechCrunches and Mashables of the world, journalists for the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post or USA Today are talking about apps on a regular basis. This is becoming such an overwhelmingly important piece of our society because we're all walking around with these smart devices that they're looking for angles and stories and things to do to educate. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the journalists and the app review sites because we get a lot of questions about this angle in particular. And our advice is really, it's pretty straightforward. We've written a post I've linked to. I think we'll be making this presentation available later. But what's important is to understand that the journalists and the app review sites are run by people, right? On the other end of that email that you're going to send out to people is another person who's really busy. And so the last thing you want to do is when you need somebody to write about you, you email them the day before. That never works, right? That's not the way to do it. Instead, what we recommend is creating a list of between 5 and 20 journalists or app review sites that you think are particularly relevant to what you're doing and creating relationships with them. If you engage with them on Twitter, if you read what they write and then you comment on it, if you email them about the space in general and you say, hey, I know you write quite a bit about presentations and knowledge workers and how communication of ideas is changing, and I have this insight into this space because you're working on a presentation-oriented iPad app, you can add value to that person's life. You can make their job easier. You can educate them. And then when it comes time to tell them about the latest update of your app or the launch of your app, they're much more likely to say, oh, I've talked to John before. John's super knowledgeable in this space. Makes sense that he's an expert and expert enough to be sharing out an app that does X, Y, and Z that's really important. So really, don't view app review sites and journalists as I just check the box right before I launch my app or launch an update. What you really want to be doing is cultivating a list of people and creating relationships with those people. And I can tell you from our customer base, some of our customers are extraordinary at this, have really deep, meaningful relationships with 3 to 5 journalists who on a regular basis they talk to, they get quoted, and the benefits around that and the installations that are driven are really massive. And as I'll be talking about a little bit later, it looks like the LTV of customers who come through these channels tends to actually be really good too if you've targeted these journalists and app review sites well, much better than paid advertising. In fact, to that end, our friend Victor Agreda at the unofficial Apple weblog has said they often drive more sales and downloads of an app than an Apple feature in the App Store, which is, the first time I heard it was kind of shocking. So I pulled him aside and I asked him some questions about this. And sure enough, for certain verticals and certain types of apps, because their stories are detailed, because oftentimes the amount of attention that they pay to what you're doing and why it's important can really expand what you're doing and communicate in an effective way, they're able to convince far more consumers that your app with its specific focus is important to download than just getting featured on the front page of the App Store to the broad masses, where most people might look at your logo and look at the description and say, that's not for me, right? Like, it's very important to think about targeting and having your message communicated in a meaningful manner. And as we see more sophisticated apps coming online, in particular the enterprise software space, we're seeing a lot of companies with enterprise software who are developing apps, publishing apps, reaching existing customers and then new customers in the App Store. Well, a lot of times that software is just not appropriate to be featured. It's not broadly meaningful. But having a site that talks a lot about enterprise software, talk about you and how it ties into your existing solution or brings something new to the mobile world, that's going to generate a lot more meaningful traffic. I also talked a little bit about this notion of getting vertical. And what I mean by that, and this for many of you, I think, given the fact that when you're small, you have to really focus, is a place that most of you are missing, but it can be really valuable. So again, this example I'm talking about is if you have an app that's related to recipes and cooking, there are meaningful blogs out there that generate hundreds of thousands, if not millions of page views a month from consumers who are interested in recipes and cooking and the process of creating food. These vertical blogs, these sites that are devoted to this topic, have a whole host of customers who are waiting for you to tell them about what you do and solve their problems. And generally speaking, these vertical sites are not actually being approached or talked to or educated. So I would highly recommend you to take a couple minutes at the end of this just to think a little bit more deeply about what vertical your app is in. I think there's a really easy takeaway that you can have is, what vertical am I in? Who can I talk to in this space that has a meaningful audience that's super relevant to us that we haven't done before? And if you've done this to some extent and had some success and you've let it drop, I would urge you to go back and continue to invest in it because, again, through our customer base, we learn about this stuff from time to time. Some of them have ongoing relationships and ongoing pieces, so it's not just a matter of getting that blogger to write about your app and how it's useful to the audience once. It's become, for some of them, an ongoing section where they actually help the blog create content around what's emerging in mobile as a set of tools that help the consumers out. And so then they're able to have a regular presence, like a monthly column on mobile meets cooking. It can be valuable, especially if you take the approach of what are the consumers on the site thinking about, what do they want, what do they crave, and how can I educate them with the content that I have. And yes, tell them about my app, but most importantly, add value so that they know and are aware of you. So returning back to this equation, the math of the app business, I think we've gone through the installs. We've talked about many methods that customers are finding you and installing you and the ways to convert them and be successful. I want to move on to what really is the single biggest problem. So many of you are probably very focused on user acquisition and the install piece. And I know that Google Ventures is going to be having a session on user acquisition in the mobile space in a few weeks. But ultimately, the real problem almost all of you are going to face, and it's going to be terribly frustrating, is retention. This is the retention curve for iOS and Android apps. And if you look at this, what it says is that after 12 months, only 4% of the consumers who download you today are still around, right? Even more shocking is that 3 months from now, only 24% of those people are around. And that means if you're spending money on pay-per-click or pay-per-install campaigns, on average, people are spending $1.50, $2 per install today. You're spending money on that, and 3/4 of those people are gone 3 months from now. Effectively, you've wasted 3/4 of that acquisition budget, right? So your pay-per install is not $1.50, it's 3 times that. So it's really important to understand that this dynamic faces almost all of you. We've met a few of our customers who have really high retention, and they're definitely the exception to the rule. In general, this curve applies over and over again, regardless of the vertical that you're in. And so you've got to be thinking about this. And as you're thinking about investing in your business and growing it, what we really encourage you to think about is that you're not necessarily just a software company anymore. You're a media company. And what I mean by that is that traditional media companies are really focused on finding an audience and then delighting it and retaining it and then growing it. And I hope what you take away from that is that if you're focused on just growing your audience before you know which audience you really resonate with, you're probably putting the cart before the horse. The first thing is to figure out who really uses your app and loves it. And the reason that's super important, there are several, but the first is that audience that really is a big fan and proponent of you can be tremendously powerful in taking your app from a place where you've got a couple thousand active users a month, or 10,000 active users a month, or 100,000 active users a month, to the millions. Because when you have a really engaged audience that loves you, they are talking about you. People love to share things they're proud of, that make them feel successful. And because our apps, we pull them out all the time and look at them while we're sitting at a table with our friends during dinner, or while we're waiting for the bus, or when you're in the car, people have moments all throughout their days, all throughout their lives to tell other people about them. And if you've got a real handle on the people who love you, the people who are using you on a regular basis, and why, and you're engaging with those people, they'll take your message and they will expand on that message and tell their friends, and they will also come back to you and tell you how to do an even better job. I find this quote from Einstein decades ago to be incredibly relevant here, because I really think the customers always crave to be heard. They always want to be listened to. And as we go to a more technologically focused society, we've seen many, many companies want to automate out the customer relationship aspect of this, the conversation aspect of it. But that human interaction is really important. And that human interaction with a device that people have in their pocket, when you've got that install in their pocket, is a really big opportunity for you to connect and do something special and make some meaning. Because this loyal and loving audience actually will take you into those other places. So I was telling you about App Store inbound marketing and these organic methods of discovery and having other ways to be referred to. It turns out that the apps that are most successful and create the most rabid fan base have those fans going telling sites, journalists, vertical blogs, even before you can do it. Right? That's one of the most tremendous things that happens when an app starts really resonating and hitting sort of a peak in terms of excitement and devotion from their customer base. Those customers will go out and tell people. And so you don't necessarily have to do all of that work. Doing that legwork is important. Making that list is important. I definitely recommend building that relationship. But when your customer base is bigger than you are and they're more vocal, it lends a lot of credibility. And in particular, we see this happening more and more with journalists. So how do you actually engage with these customers? How do you make sure that you go from a place where you're looking at your download count in the App Store and you're saying, oh, we got 10,000 downloads this week, that's amazing, we feel really great, to having 10,000 loyal customers, or even just 1,000 of them who are loyal and like what you're doing? This is something that we really are focused on. I'm going to talk a little bit about the tactics and show you a little bit more of what we do around this, but really it ultimately comes back to the fact that just talking with those people, having that relationship, that's incredibly important. So everything from making sure that people stay in your app to give you feedback, to reaching out and proactively finding out how people are feeling and figuring out why they're a big fan of you. Simple tactics, done intelligently, connected to a smart server with an interface that allows you to interact with these customers, takes your experience in your app from a place where it's sort of flat to where it's rich. And I really want to emphasize the fact that you've made this software, and it's powerful, and it's in people's pockets. But if you're not using that software to regularly communicate with your customer, you've really missed that opportunity. You did all of the hard work of getting on their device, and now you're missing the easy work of being there and being present. I like to use the analogy. We're from Seattle. We see a lot of companies up in Seattle that are great at customer service. The analogy of bringing the Nordstrom experience to the app. And what I mean by that is if you've ever gone into Nordstrom, more likely than not, somebody at some point asked you if you needed help. But they didn't do it in that annoying way, the way where like somebody comes up and is like, do you need help? And then another person comes up and is like, do you need help? And you always sort of feel like you're being sold to. Instead, there's one person responsible for the area you're in, and they asked you once, and then they backed away, and you always knew if you needed something, they were there, and you felt pleasant about it, and they made you feel comfortable. Well, you can do that inside your app. You can make sure that they know there's an easy way to get to you, to give them feedback or contact them. And there's also sometimes an appropriate time to prompt them and reach out and find out how they're feeling. And you don't have to do it more than once. Just opening that communications channel is really super helpful. And the side benefit of opening that communication channel is that the de facto action on the part of a consumer is to just disappear. If they're frustrated, if something's confusing, they'll just leave your app. They'll never come back. They'll uninstall it. You'll never have any data around that. But instead, when you're reaching out, you're able to do this. You can intercept that frustration. You can say, do you need anything at all? Are you happy? Are you delighted, et cetera? They say no. The opportunity for them to speak to you is now there, and you've made it super easy. And so as a result, people can actually talk back to you. And we see a lot of constructive criticism come through this. In fact, we experiment a lot with the language for the prompts that we have, and then the various messages that we show to people. And we found that this phrasing that I use here, we appreciate your constructive feedback, has changed the length of the feedback that people give, that you've involved them in the process of making your app better. And whether or not you're using our solution or something you've done internally, I encourage you to think very deeply about the simple steps you can take to welcome somebody into the process of talking with you and engaging with you. Because it does a lot in terms of making a difference and engaging with those customers. And you might say to yourself, well, I don't know. I don't necessarily want all these people bashing me. They're already angry, and they're not going to be a customer anyway. Do I want to deal with that? The data around this is very hard to argue with. You see 70% of dissatisfied consumers return if they feel like their complaint's been resolved in a favorable manner. And oftentimes, resolution in a favorable manner for a consumer is just apologizing. How many times have you been really frustrated in some scenario, and all it took was the person behind the counter to be like, I'm sorry. Like, I can't fix it. I wish I could. I'm sorry. I had this a few weeks ago. I was traveling. I was at an airline counter. I was late for my flight. I missed it. They had to reschedule me, right? I was super frustrated. And that person behind the counter couldn't do anything, but they just said, I'm sorry. And then they endeavored to actually try and resolve it in a way that I was able to travel a little bit later. But they didn't make my problem right then go away, but they made me feel better, and they were a human. And I think that all of us who are making software really need to focus on the fact that this software is helpful to connect more deeply with consumers, because regardless of the fact that we're on our phones, we're still people with emotions who can feel frustrated and uncomfortable, and you can take that as an opportunity to win somebody over. And in fact, what we see over and over again from our customer base is that companies who listen to their customers and then respond back to them take those customers who are upset and frustrated and move them to a place where they're evangelists. They're really big fans. Why? Just because they took that step of being different. Harking back to what I was talking about earlier, most companies don't do this. You have the opportunity to be different. You have the opportunity to differentiate yourself by communicating with your customers. So, in this cycle of communicating with your customers, getting feedback, interacting, we have a few actionable tips that we've learned from our customers about how this works, and it's really pretty simple. So the first thing, always, I don't care how upset that person is when they reach out to you, you say thank you. You appreciate it, right? And the reason is very simple. Less than 1% of your customer base is likely to, at any point in time, just on their own, reach out and talk to you. I'm not talking about you reaching out proactively and then intercepting that negative feedback. I'm talking about just on their own, raising their hand and talking to you. Less than 1%. It's usually actually less than 0.1%. Very small portion do that. For that person, that's an investment in time, especially when you think about how busy we are and how much other stuff we have going on in our lives and what else is happening on our device. Any customer who's actually taken the time to send something to you has really invested in you in a way that's different from most customers. So thank them, appreciate them, think about that. Apologize. I don't care if they were wrong and they're jerks to you. It doesn't hurt to apologize. It never hurts in this context to apologize. If you can't, if you're upset, if they got too personal, walk away. Don't get ticked off and let that come back into your response to people. Try to solve it, right? So if somebody's coming to you and they're saying, this thing's crashing, or I can't make a purchase, or I didn't get credited for the gold in my account around the in-app purchase system that you use, see if you can figure it out, if you can solve it. If you can solve it right away, you're a hero, right? That's amazing. Customer goes from like, I never thought I was going to hear back. And this is, quite honestly, in the mobile space, what happens more often than not is consumers don't even expect to hear back. They just think they're thrown over the wall and they're not going to hear back. So if you can solve it right away, you become a hero. And if you are going to solve it, let them know that you're going to solve it. I think that's really important. And then make sure you follow up. So let's say you weren't able to take action right away, or you did take action, but you didn't hear back. Take that time to make sure that they're happy. It sounds like it's a little bit expensive, and this is sort of why we built some of the tools that we do. It makes it easy to follow up. But making that extra step goes a really long way. People feel very special. And out of this, some of these people who are frustrated are going to become evangelists. They're going to take the time to go the next step. They're going to go to the App Store and say, wow, these guys were amazing. I had this real problem, and then they solved it for me. I think that the important thing is to empower and reward those people and make sure that they feel special, because then you've now identified somebody who's going to take that next step of going and talking about you further. So I want to talk a little bit about another problem that faces developers on a really regular basis, is that they don't know how their customers think. So the easiest way to do this is actually to ask them, like figure out what's going on. And you can do this inside your app. So you can actually display surveys inside the app, and you can find out why they exited the purchase funnel. You can figure out what they wanted to see next, how a feature landed. Really quickly and easily in a native environment that's tappable, it's quick to respond to, you can do this. I would urge you, if you're thinking about doing this, to start small. The 10-question survey doesn't work on mobile. The 10-question web survey definitely doesn't work on mobile, right? You want it to be native, you want it to be quick, you want it to be discreet, and you want it to be something that they can cancel out of. You want to be able to get these results, right, at a glance. This is something we do again, so that you actually take that and turn it into information, so that you're learning. You're able to see, for example, this is one of our customers that delivers video, and after videos play but not to completion, they ask about the experience, kind of like a post-call Skype survey. And at a glance, they're able to say, oh, hey, the problem here, the reason people left was not primarily because of video quality. So this information is really valuable for you. Some sample surveys and use cases that people use. You release a new feature and you figure out how it landed. So after somebody's gone through that feature, quick 2-question survey. Did it work for you? Did it make sense? You can learn a lot from that, especially if you give a free-form text input field at the end of it. Finding out more about your audience. So you've got 10,000 people using you on a regular basis. Who are they? Maybe you have an analytics package and it's telling you something about geographic details and some assumed demographics, but you can find out more explicitly. You can find out about what they're interested in, why they found you. You can really do a lot to optimize your product roadmap. We find that in almost every organization we deal with, they're resource constrained. They don't have enough mobile engineers to work on their mobile apps, and they're always trying to work against a 9-12-month product roadmap that seems to always expand, and they don't know that they're working on the most important things. Well, it turns out you can go to your audience and you can survey them, and you can reprioritize, and you can add things to the list that you didn't have on there before, and you could drop things from the list that you thought were really important but nobody cares about. And you can really do a lot to investigate drop-off points in your funnel. We see a lot of times in trying to build this business and trying to grow your average revenue per user that you have purchase funnels. You have in-app purchase funnels, you have commerce purchase funnels, you have accomplishments that people hit on their way to becoming a pro consumer of maybe a freemium app. At any point in time, people drop out of that. Find out why. Try to understand what's going on for them. And if you're really in the advertising space and you're building a brand advertising case to large brands, oftentimes those brands expect to know something about awareness and recall around their ads. And generally speaking, as a startup or a small company, you don't have much in the way of resources in order to do those studies, especially offline studies, which are very expensive and they're very challenging to do. Well, it turns out you can hook in your ad campaigns to surveys and then discover and run surveys around brand awareness and brand recall, which allows you to garner higher CPMs and be more successful. So these are some samples. And then I want to hark back to the math of the app business and talk about how you might be thinking about prioritizing, investing in talking to your customers internally and trying to make the case for it. We hear it over and over again. We're a methodical organization. We do a lot of cost-benefit analysis. We work on the most high-priority things. So you might believe that this is important. How do you make the case for it? Well, since you've got this equation, installs times retention equals active users times your average revenue per user, it's relatively easy to make some simple assumptions about the way in which you can impact your business by engaging with your customers and making more time to make them happy. And so these are pretty conservative assumptions. We don't even generally assume that communicating with your consumers near term impacts your average revenue per user. But if you're just conservative about this, you end up in a pretty quick manner coming to the conclusion that, in particular, higher retention leads to pretty massive impacts on the bottom line. And if you're more successful at converting customers to download your app because your ratings and reviews and the decision criteria in your app store are better, you will grow your business on a regular basis. And so I would encourage you to be thinking about this math, doing these equations on a regular basis. And then this last point, and we find a lot of people sort of puzzled about this, is that the state of affairs today in mobile is most of you don't know who your customers are, you don't get much customer data around it. Once you actually start communicating with customers, you create a customer database. You have that person's email address, you might know how they're using your app. Having that database allows you to communicate to them on a regular basis. It has a direct line of contact that's not just the app. So even if they've uninstalled it, you might be able to talk to them again when you do an update. And so creating that ongoing asset of customers who have been with you at least at some point in time, maybe are still with you, is really important. So a couple last things to wrap this up. We really believe you should involve your customers, that they're part of building a great app and that they have the opportunity to spread the word. And that we think that you really should incorporate customer feedback by making it easy to listen, giving yourself the ability to respond to those customers, that you should really design for feedback and communication. That's a core competency you need to have. That you should emphasize relationships with your customers, because ultimately, for most of you, a customer is here today and gone a month from now is not very valuable, and what you want is a customer who's going to be here today and here 12 months from now. So develop those relationships. And you want to earn and cultivate the love. And sometimes when I say that, people are sort of taken aback, but I really think that customers should love you. I think it's very important. So finally, reminder, we're always here to help. We love Google Ventures and what they're doing. We think the Startup Lab is an awesome resource. We love talking to customers and helping you grow your businesses. You don't have to be a customer of ours just to lean on us and ask questions. So I'm Roby at Apptentive. You can find me on Twitter or our company on Twitter. And we have this offer for portfolio companies. So that's the bulk of the presentation. I see here on this device that we have some questions. So I'm going to just go from the top. Krishna at App Purify asks, what matters most for the publisher? Ratings, rankings, or the number of reviews? And I think that the confusing aspect of this is asks rankings. And so rankings are probably number one if you think about it in terms of like where you're showing up on search results and the categories, lists, and just overall store lists, because so many of the consumers are ultimately navigating in a bit of a passive manner. So rankings are really meaningfully important. But ratings and reviews tie into those rankings. It turns out that they're really quite important. And if I was to rank after the rankings, ratings or reviews, I would actually say that the number of reviews are most important. And the reason is that for most apps, you'll see a really big delta in terms of how many people have rated the app versus how many people have reviewed it. On average, I think it's 1 in 5 to 1 in 8 people who rate the app then take the next step of reviewing it. But those reviews, because they come with a bunch of text that the app stores can then parse and look through, and then they also are the data points that the next consumer looks at, are really much more important. And so you want to have a meaningful amount of content that's been written by consumers. Again, going back to this point that ephemeral digital goods are hard to evaluate without ratings and reviews, means that written review in particular is important, and then ratings after that. When do you recommend serving the prompts, i.e. so many times opening the app immediately? This is a great question. We get this a lot. The answer is, first and foremost, give yourself a way to experiment around it. This is something we do that's proven to be very successful for publishers, and why I would highly recommend working with us. But if you're doing it on your own, if you don't have the data around what's working and what's not, it doesn't matter what your settings are, because the reality is your settings will change over time. We see this actually quite a bit where an app launches and they're brand new and they have a small audience, and so they'll do outreach after like 3 days on device and 5 app launches. And what they're really trying to do, their goal in that scenario, is to get more people engaged and giving them feedback, and they'll learn faster because they're reaching out to people. But as they start to hit a point of maturity, they have 100,000 monthly active users. What they're trying to focus on now is finding the people who are happiest that they're reaching out to, because they're trying to find ratings and generate more positive sentiment in the App Store. And that those people later on down the line have a different set of criteria that they want to launch the prompt based upon. And so I think it's important to give yourself the tools to see the data. Like, of the people who saw the prompt, which of them opted to actually go rate you in the App Store? So we present a lot of this data to our customers and make it easy for them to understand what's going on and make changes in real time. I think that's ultimately the answer, is give yourself information so that you can iterate. But the other piece of this is, so we have 3 criteria that we allow people to show the prompt on, and it stays on device, app launches, and a variable we call significant events. That is supposed to be specific to each and every app. So if you're a game, it might be significant that somebody hit the 3rd level. If you're an e-commerce app, it might be significant that they put in a credit card, or that they actually made their first purchase, or put something in a basket. Those things are very specific to you, and so we find that the customers of ours who actually pass along variables for significant events have done 2 things. 1, they've thought about what's important for their customer, like what moments in time are important in their app. And 2, they've allowed themselves to have some control around prompting on that, and that actually generates pretty meaningful results. Any tips for dealing with existing negative reviews? So I've seen a lot of customers do some interesting stuff around existing negative reviews, going so far as to Google people, search for them on Twitter, see if they can find some route of tracking that person down and having them change their review. More often than not, doing that it's overly aggressive, and there's a lot of backlash that comes out of that. People feel like they're stalked. I would say, instead of doing that, you got to look forward, and you got to say, what can I learn from that negative review, and what can I take from it to make a better app the next time around? And also, what can I do to take the audience that I have that really loves me to go talk about me and say other things? So you might have a regular set of trolls. We see this with a lot of apps. There's like a sort of, for whatever reason, a set of trolls who are just very comfortable sort of shouting negatively in the App Store. But once that app has a dedicated audience of 10,000, 50,000, 100,000 monthly active users, there's a really big base of people who are happy on a regular basis. And just activating those people who are happy and making sure that they have an easy route to go to the App Store and say great things drowns out the trolls. So I would spend less time going back and dealing with existing negative reviews and trying to get that change, and more time on learning from it and activating the customers who really love you and making sure that your evangelists are saying great things. I think one of the things that's very important to understand is that if your app has 10,000 or 50,000 or 100,000 people using it on a regular basis, they're voting with their actions that, generally speaking, they're happy with what you're doing. They're fans of yours. And most of the customers we see before we start working with them, they assume that those 5 or 10 or 100 or 200 people who are ranting and raving in the App Store are indicative, but they forget that they've already succeeded with 100,000 other people. Making sure that those 100,000 other people are using their voice and talking about what's great about you is much more important. I think aim positive when it comes to this stuff. Any thoughts on how much you should localize your App Store presence or feedback channels in other languages? This is a great question. So we're actually going through the process right now of localizing in about 10 languages. And the reason that we've come to the conclusion that it's time for us to do this is actually predicated on our customers telling us, okay, we've got enough international presence, we have enough traffic in other countries that we would love to deliver the same level of service and connection in those languages natively. And so I think that if you're seeing traction in other countries, if people are downloading you or discovering you, you should absolutely be focusing on the top sort of 2 to 5 markets where you're seeing that traction and experimenting with localizing. I would do research around which markets have the lowest penetration of English. So for example, if you were really popular in the Philippines, it turns out English is relatively popular in the Philippines, so that might not be the right place for you to spend resources, but simplified Chinese might be a good place for you to invest. So I would do some analysis around that. And then similarly, if you're seeing some of that success, localizing your App Store presence is really very helpful. So that discovery mechanism, the fact that people are navigating and finding you in the App Store, again, in markets where English is not very prevalent, that's a place where you can do a much better job communicating about what you're doing. But I think what you want to do is you want to try and marry the experiences. So it's not sufficient to just localize your App Store presence, but then have a text-heavy app that hasn't been localized. Because as soon as you've localized the App Store presence, if your app isn't localized and it requires a decent amount of text-based communication, you're going to fall on your face in front of customers. And what will often happen when companies do that is they'll get a lot of adoption, and then they'll get a lot of criticism in the App Store. So you want to marry those things. And I think prioritizing around where you're seeing some traction or where you think you could resonate and the markets you want to go to is really important. And generally the top 10 markets are pretty obvious. You might have a specific niche, but I think focusing on the top 10 is where we see most people today doing that, unless they have extraordinary resources. Any other questions? Well, this has been great. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And again, let me know if you have any questions whatsoever. We're here to help. Morning, everybody. So I'm Roby Ganguly, CEO and co-founder of Aptenev, Google Ventures-backed company that is really focused on making it easy for every company with an app to talk with their customers. So I'll just kick it off. I'm always open to questions and interruptions. It's fine, just raise your hand or send it through the online forum. So we're in this business for a really simple reason, and that's because consumers today are really obsessed with their smartphones. We check them first thing in the morning, last thing at night. We have anxiety around when our battery is low or it's dead. And as a result of that, more and more businesses every day are really coming around to the fact that their consumers are on their smartphones, and this is a great place to connect with their customers. And so many of you are probably already in the space making apps, and you've realized pretty quickly that this is a great place to engage and get adoption and deliver your services. But as a consumer, when you're using these apps and you have a problem or a question or something doesn't make sense, or maybe you just want to have a deeper connection with that company you're dealing with, where do you find yourself? Today, the answer is the App Store, right? This App Store is a wall between us and the people who make the apps. It's a place where we vent. We're frustrated, we rant, and it's not even clear that anybody's actually really listening, that they're on the other end and they're reading these comments. And from the publishers who are frustrated, like for example, this frustrated consumer, we're actually in the app able to send this message and give context and start the beginning of the dialogue with Urban Spoon. And so when you have this dialogue, it opens up a conversation that actually can be productive. So Matthew was able to take this and see in his inbox, which is powered by Apptentive, this comment, and he's able to actually ask a further question, find out what's going on, discover that this customer is in St. Louis, and then tell them, hey, we know that's an issue. We are not in St. Louis yet, we're working on it. And because this dialogue actually is kind of specific and it requires some follow-up, Matthew was really easily able to add him to a group and make sure that he categorized this person appropriately. Fast forward a few weeks, Matthew and the Urban Spoon team, they've actually been working on rolling themselves out into multiple different markets. They actually launched in St. Louis. And with a couple clicks, they're able to communicate very quickly and personally back to the customers who are on that St. Louis announcement list. And the next time a customer opens up the app, this badge shows that Message Center, powered by Apptentive, has a message waiting for the consumer. And there's a personal and direct message that really communicates to that customer that you were listened to, your issue was heard, and you were remembered, which is very, very powerful. And so as a result, that consumer goes from being really frustrated and in a place where they're swearing to a place where they're like, wow, thank you. I love you guys. There's perspective. From the companies who are making these apps, it's really even worse because you know that every new consumer who interacts with your app sees this first, right? And you don't really have any context or any real meaningful way to develop a relationship or respond to your consumers in the app stores. So what we hear over and over again from publishers is that the ratings and reviews in the App Store are really no better than graffiti on a wall. And this is where we come in. This is a really big communications failure, and so our company is obsessed with bringing that connection together between consumers and the publishers behind the apps. So a very quick overview of the things that we are really great at. We're very focused on being the best company, allowing you to engage with your customers, whether that's delivering in-app surveys, whether that's driving better ratings and reviews at scale and getting actionable customer feedback, or really improving your app retention. And the underlying point around all of this is that we believe that happy customers become loyal customers, and loyal customers generate revenue and really drop to the bottom line. And we think that you have to be obsessed with having very loyal customers who love you over the long term if you want to be successful. So that's sort of a quick overview. But I know that many of us here in the Google Ventures community watch these videos online, and an hour is quite a bit of a long time. So I want to make a couple quick offers to you, really just knowing that you might not make it through the entire 60 minutes, or you might be in the App Store at this point in time. They've been around since 2008. They have over 20 million customers across multiple platforms. They're a 50-person company that actually is a subsidiary of IAC. And there's a pretty good chance that many of you already have installed Urban Spoon on your phone, which means you already have Apptentive in your pocket. And before they were working with us, Matt, the director of UX, who's one of our key customers there, was on a regular basis greeted with this when he would wake up in the morning. We know that a lot of people spend their time looking at the ratings and reviews in the App Store in order to get sentiment, to understand what's going on for their customer base. And so he would wake up in the morning and be greeted with a message like this, and he was frustrated. The reason he was frustrated was because this right here, this typical review, is not very useful. There's no context around what's going on for this customer. So for example, in this situation, customer's saying, I can't book reservations. That's a feature of that. But Matt doesn't have any way of understanding where that customer is. For example, he's in a market that Urban Spoon doesn't support. Or what he's trying to book a reservation for. Like, is this even relevant to him? Is it about a restaurant? Or is it a hotel and something that they don't even offer? Which I think we all know, sometimes customers come to you with questions about what you do that are just really not relevant. So this was really frustrating. But after starting to work with us and with a two-line code chain, change, Urban Spoon was able to turn their app into a communications vehicle. So they could actually really easily reach out proactively, try to figure out how somebody felt, for example. And the people might watch it a few weeks from now. If you're in the mobile app space and you want to talk about your app, if you want to ping us, get some advice, we're always here to help. That's actually our favorite way of interacting with customers because we love relationships too. So I'm Roby at aptentive.com. Just email me, say, we're a GV company, we want to chat with you, 15, 30 minutes, whatever works for you and your schedule. We're here to help. And also, really quickly, as a headline, we are making an offer to all GV portfolio companies on our plans and sign-up page. You guys get 3 months free. All you have to do is enter this code under the promotional code section, it's GV port code. So again, I know that everybody's busy. You don't necessarily make it through the entire video the first time around. So those are a couple of headlines. What am I going to be covering today? So really 4 big things, and we've covered the first one. So rest assured, this should be pretty straightforward. The big problem facing every company in the mobile app space, which is really this connection with your customers, knowing who they are, developing a relationship with them, understanding how to talk to them. Some details with a specific example of how we help, and then really digging in deeper, and this is going to be the bulk of the presentation, and talking about the mobile app business, end to end, the key drivers of that business, how you make money, how you retain customers, what the sort of leverage points you have are, and some of the components of a good mobile toolkit. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about one of our key customers, Urban Spoon. So Urban Spoon